Okay, so here we are, continuing our exploration of the calamitous 14th century. Last time it was famine, plague, and social unrest. This time it is war, schism, and heresy. All bad things. But of course, there's also sometimes a silver lining or good things come out of it. Although I don't, it's a shame that things have to happen. All right. So our first item in the calamitous 14th century, and actually it extends into the 15th century as well, is the Hundred Years' War, okay, which was, well, an seemingly intractable war between the King of England and the King of France and their respective allies. It actually lasted for 116 years. And it begins over a question of inheritance, okay, and feudal governance. Remember that as a legacy of Charlemagne, France and Germany are divided into duchies and counties, and there are people in charge of them called dukes and counts. And obviously, in theory, the duke has to do what the king tells him, but oftentimes the duke kind of ignores what the king wants him to do. So, one of the long-term goals of the kings of France over the course of the Middle Ages is to assert his will, assert his dominance over his dukes and his counts. And this was especially true in the case of the Duchy of Aquitaine, which is a duchy in the southwest of France that also happens to be held by the King of England. Okay, so this is the pluralism in the second estate, right? You can have more than one duchy, you can have more than one kingdom if you've inherited it. And this happened when Eleanor of Aquitaine, who was an heiress, married Henry II and made him Duke of Aquitaine, Henry II being King of England. And so from the 12th century, the kings of England have also been the Dukes of Aquitaine. And this really annoyed the King of France, that part of his kingdom was in the hands of a diplomatic rival. But it was a bonus, because every time there was some kind of a diplomatic dispute between the King of England and the King of France, the King of France could say, aha, you're not being a good Duke of Aquitaine. You are not doing what I want you to do as my Duke. You owe allegiance to me. And so the King of France can try to confiscate Aquitaine. And this happens a number of times. Usually it's patched up diplomatically. Usually the kings of England can successfully defend their claims to Aquitaine. It happened again in 1337. Actually, there was a man named Robert d'Artois who was expelled from the court of the French king, and he went across the channel to England, and Edward III, King of England, welcomed him at his court. And when Philip VI, King of France, found out about that, he said, "Oh my goodness, how dare you? How dare you do this? You are not being a good Duke of Aquitaine. Aquitaine is mine." And Edward III, King of England, countered with, "Excuse me? Not only is Aquitaine mine, but the whole of France is mine. I am rightly King of France." And I'll explain this in a minute. Okay, here's a map showing what's going on here. Okay, everywhere in green is the area of France that is directly controlled by the king. That's the royal domain. Okay, everything in yellow is part of the Kingdom of France, but is in the control of some other duke or count. Generally, these people are allied with the King of France, but, not necessarily. They certainly have a very independent streak. And then down in the southwest there, English Aquitaine. That's the Duchy of Aquitaine, and that is in the hands of the King of England, or Angleterre, as it says in this map. And that is, it's like a sliver. It's a thorn in the side of the King of France. Okay, now how on earth does Edward III claim France? Well, here's a genealogical chart. It sort of speaks for itself. Okay, you can see there Philip III is King of France, dies in 1285. The throne is inherited by his first son, Philip IV, who reigns from 1285 down to 1314. Philip IV is known as Philip the Fair, okay, but that refers to his hair color. It does not refer to his sense of justice. Philip IV was, well, he was pretty nasty, actually. He's the one who contrived to get the Templars declared heretical, for instance, and grabbed most of their wealth, okay? But I guess God had his revenge, okay, because as you can see, Philip IV had 3 sons who survived to adulthood, all of whom were king in their turn, but none of whom produced any heirs. So you've got Louis X, Philip V, and then Charles IV, and he died in 1328 without leaving an heir. And that was it for the so-called Capetian miracle, okay? The dynasty that rules France from 987 was known as the Capetian dynasty. And what's miraculous about them? Well, what's miraculous is that every time a king dies, there is an adult male son willing to take over. Okay? That's not the case in Germany, all right? In Germany, there are always succession disputes, and oftentimes the king dies and the heir is an infant, which is always an unstable situation. But in France, the opposite happens. So from 987 all the way down to 1328, the French monarchy is relatively stable, okay? There always is someone going to take over, and everyone recognizes it, okay? Primogeniture has established itself in France by this time. Okay, so the first-born son takes over, he's an adult, and he can exercise his office with a certain amount of competence. Okay, but when Charles IV died in 1328, there was no heir. So what do we do? How do we determine the next king? Well, if it was any other title, if it was any other piece of property, what happens when all the sons are dead is that you then go to the daughters, okay? And the daughters become heiresses, all right? And that means the property gets transferred to her husband and then to her son, okay? And so, look at that. Charles IV dies in 1328. It should go to his sister, Isabella, who happened to be married to Edward II, King of England. All right? Now, Edward II had been assassinated in 1327, but she had a son, Edward III, King of England. He becomes King of England in 1327. And by rights, Edward III should become King of France through right of inheritance. The French, of course, were not about to tolerate that. Even in the 14th century, there is a sense of nationalism, and they are not willing to have a King of England ruling them. So they sort of pulled out of their back pocket something that they called the Salic Law, saying that women they can't inherit, but they can't even transfer the throne. So they went back up the genealogical table, and the closest male relative is going to be Philip of Valois, Charles IV's cousin, who is crowned Philip VI in 1328. And Edward III at the time was only 15 years old. He was in no position to press his claim to the throne of France, so he did obedience. He swore his fealty to Philip VI for Aquitaine. But in 1337, he reneges on that because Philip VI tried to confiscate Aquitaine. He says, wait a minute, you're not going to do that. You're not going to do that. In fact, I am going to revive my claim to the throne of France through my mother, Isabella. This is reflected heraldically, okay? The coat of arms of the King of France is a red field with 3 gold lions on it. But after 1340, Edward III expressed his claim to the throne of France heraldically. This is what you do with a coat of arms. When each parent has a coat of arms, you quarter it like this. And so you've got, Edward is basically expressing that he is the son of a king of England and the son of a queen of France. So we have the gold lions of England, but also the gold fleur-de-lis of France, quartered. All right, so I am king of England and king of France. This is my patrimony. Okay, and this launched the 100 Years' War, which, as you can tell, went on for a very long time. Now, there were stretches of truce when there wasn't any fighting going on, but it was a very, it was a fun activity for the English. They would levy taxes, they would raise an army, build boats, take the whole thing to France, and go on a chevauchée, all right, which is... well, it's not particularly it's not particularly chivalric, all right, to go on a chevauchée. It really is kind of like Sherman through Georgia. They would come down, they would burn crops, slaughter animals, burn peasant villages, kill anyone who offered any opposition. And the whole thing was simply it was an insult, a very grave and serious insult to the King of France. You can't defend your people, okay? And, basically telling the people of France, look, your king can't defend you. Now, the French do get their armies together, and they do chase the English, and sometimes they even corner them and force a battle, which sometimes the French win. But oftentimes the English win. Why? Again, because the English are somewhat less chivalric than the French are. The French are deeply invested in the whole notion of the knight on horseback, charging with a lance, fighting with a sword, okay? Whereas the English have no problem killing from a distance. They have these archers who can shoot from afar, and, if you've got a whole bunch of archers shooting with long bows, you have a very rapid rate of fire. If you don't get the knight, you will kill the horse. Okay, and even if the knights are wearing plate armor, to be hit with an arrow at full speed, it's like being shot wearing a bulletproof vest. The bullet might not penetrate the vest, but it's a very, it's a hefty blow. Okay. And you might be put out of commission just by being hit with an arrow, even if it doesn't penetrate the armor. Okay? And so that's the deal with English archery. And there are 3 great English victories, Crécy, Poitiers, and Agincourt, all of which involved English archers killing from a distance. Okay? There is a depiction of one of the battles of the 100 Years' War. You can see there the fleur-de-lis and the lions of the English, and then, of course, some archers in the foreground. Okay, and, sort of, it went kind of back and forth. The English would go on a chevauchée, force the battle, win the battle, and then force some kind of diplomatic settlement on the French. Oftentimes, they would agree to relinquish their claim to the throne of France in return for, an enlarged Aquitaine. But time is on the side of the French. They have home field advantage, and generally what happens is the French start chipping away at Aquitaine, which leads to a renewal of the war. Okay, and then another English victory and another diplomatic settlement. So on and on it goes. Some people do well out of this. As every war has war profiteers and people who get lots of booty. But, there's a great deal of misery as well. You wouldn't want to be a French peasant in the path of the English army. Okay, so eventually, into the 15th century now, what we see is the rise of one of the more remarkable figures of the Middle Ages, and that is Joan of Arc, whom you may have heard of. She was a French peasant girl from Champagne in northeastern France. And starting in 1424, she heard voices in her head. Okay, and she identified these voices with three saints, St. Michael, St. Martha, and St. Catherine, and they would tell her things. And one of the things they told her was that you should go to the south of France and find the Dauphin and give him his spine back. Okay? Now, the Dauphin is the title that the French would give to the heir to the throne. It's just like in England, the heir to the throne is generally known as the Prince of Wales. Okay? So Prince Charles, of course, is Prince of Wales. So in France, the Dauphin is the heir to the throne. And he was hanging out in the south of France. This is in the wake of Agincourt, okay? Agincourt was a stunning English military victory, and basically the English occupied the top half of France and were advancing towards the south. And the Dauphin is down there, hanging out. And so Joan of Arc, at age 17, instructed by these voices, just basically gets up and leaves and walks all the way down to the south of France and finds the Dauphin and tells him, you need to go on the offensive here. And this was so remarkable. I mean, this is the heir to the King of France we're talking about. It's not done for a peasant girl just to come up and talk to him. Okay, but she was so sure of herself. It was such a weird situation that the king and his courtiers, the Dauphin and his courtiers were sort of convinced. Well, she must have God must be speaking to her. Okay, this is such a violation of protocol that there must be something special about her. And indeed, apparently she knew things about the Dauphin that only he knew. So, heck, maybe God really was speaking to her, okay? So she told him, the English are besieging Orléans, okay? It's a city in the middle of France. We need to go and chase them off. And so, yeah, they did. They gave her a suit of armor. They put her on a horse. They led what forces they had towards Orléans. They surprised the English. They chased them off. They raised the siege of Orléans. So that was a French victory. And then they did something even more cheeky. They snuck behind enemy lines, and they got to Reims Cathedral, okay? It's spelled Reims, but it's pronounced Reims. And at Reims, they held a coronation ceremony for the Dauphin. All right? Reims was the traditional venue for the coronation of French kings. And so getting there and holding a coronation ceremony for the Dauphin was a huge sort of propaganda victory for the French. All right. The English, they responded rather feebly. They held a coronation ceremony for their own king, Henry VI, who was a child. I mean, he wasn't ready to be crowned. And so, this really was, in a way, the turn of the tide. And it was sort of downhill from there. Unfortunately for Joan of Arc, she was captured, handed over to the English, and she was put on trial for witchcraft. Because, of course, if you're English, there's no way those voices are coming from God. They are coming from Satan, all right? And, Joan of Arc defended herself, but, it was a foregone conclusion. If you're being judged by the English, clearly they come from Satan. Actually, one of the things they held against Joan of Arc was the fact that she wore men's clothes. She wore a suit of armor. That was clearly, cross-dressing apparently was a sign of witchcraft in the Middle Ages. So she was burnt at the stake in Rouen in Normandy. And if you go there today, you can see the spot where she was burned. She was, of course, they held, after the 100 Years' War concluded, they held another trial for her. They overturned her conviction for witchcraft. And then she was canonized in 1920. So she is now Saint Joan of Arc. She's one of the patron saints of France. Here are a couple of images of her. On the left, we've got a painting by a 19th century painter named Ingres. This is, look at that. There's Joan of Arc, dressed in her suit of armor. And I guess a dress over that, kind of to make her appear a little more feminine, I suppose. But you'll notice she's got a halo on her head, so even though she hadn't been canonized, there are certainly people who thought of her as a saint. She's gazing off to heaven. She's got one hand on the oriflamme, that is the sacred French war banner, and a hand on the altar, all right, which is, that's no place for a woman in the Middle Ages. But you can see even in the background there's a priest with a tonsure who's kneeling in front of the great Joan of Arc. And then on the right we have a 15th century rendition of Joan of Arc, again wearing her suit of armor with the three saints who speak to her. Okay. Yeah, as I say, Joan of Arc, she dies at age 19, burnt at the stake, but that was a kind of moral example, very inspiring to the French people. And it didn't help, of course, that the English, their king was a child, and then when he became of age, it turns out he was nuts as well. He was insane. And so the English were afflicted with a bad king, and the French had momentum on their side. So by 1453, they have conquered all of Aquitaine, and, yay, France. France is, they've got the English out of there. And indeed, I suppose the English sort of deserved to lose. Their position became kind of contradictory. It starts out as a feudal dispute. A dispute over land tenure and inheritance. But if you want to be king of France, even in the Middle Ages, you have to pay attention to public opinion. You can't just come to France and crack skulls and expect that you're going to get any kind of support as king of France. Okay, you might have the divine right to be king of France, but really you want the support of the people as well. And so that's it. Well, but in a way, it's also good that the English lost Aquitaine because, maintaining overseas colonies is always a huge drain on your resources. So, the English got some good wine out of Aquitaine. So they lost their source of wine, but they also lost a major headache. Although they did continue to claim to be kings of France all the way down to 1801, and they kept the fleur-de-lis in their coat of arms as well. All right, so that's it. I mean, I suppose some good does come out of this war, but of course it's a great deal of misery in the meantime. And, the French and the English, they don't like each other very much, and the 100 Years' War is a major reason why. Okay, so if things are not so cool between France and England, there are problems with the papacy as well. From 1309 to 1377, the papacy, i.e., the Pope, the Bishop of Rome, was not in Rome. He was in Avignon, which is a town in the south of France, which is pretty unremarkable, except for the fact that the papacy was there. So how on earth did this happen? Why do we have the papacy in Avignon, of all places? People called this the Babylonian captivity of the church. It's just as the Jews were in Babylon for 70 years, so also was the papacy in Avignon for 70 years, a prisoner of the King of France. That's how a lot of people saw it. Well, remember back in the 11th century, there was that kerfuffle between Pope Gregory VII and Emperor Henry IV. And it was over the right to invest new bishops. And there was a war of words, and eventually Gregory excommunicated Henry IV, who had to come down and beg forgiveness, kneeling in the snow at Canossa. All right. That situation doesn't really prevail anymore. All right. There's still a lot of tension between church and state, or between the first two estates, between those who pray and those who fight. All right. Specifically, it's often over taxation. The church very jealously guards its income. The kings of Europe don't like that very much. I mean, here, the church, say a monastery acquires a patch of land. Now that land belongs to the monastery forever. Okay? And whatever taxes that land might have produced for the king have been lost to the king. So this is always annoying for kings to have more and more of their tax base eaten up by the church, who very jealously defended, oh no, this is now part of God's patrimony, you can't lay a finger on it. And Philip IV of France, as I say, Philip the Fair, really not so fair, said, screw you, I want my taxes and I will levy them. Pope Boniface VIII tried to excommunicate him for this. So Philip IV sent down a squad to beat him up. And he died shortly thereafter. Okay? So, and he retained control of his kingdom. I mean, that's not, it's not going to be able to cause a rebellion in France because the king has been excommunicated. That doesn't really prevail anymore. And so there was a brief papacy of Benedict XI, and then Pope Clement V comes to the throne. And he figures that you should keep your friends close and your enemies closer. So he moved the papacy to Avignon, which, is safer. I mean, Rome was pretty rough anyway. Avignon is safer. It's also closer to the King of France to sort of reassure the King of France that, everything's okay between us, right? Haha. Unfortunately, that didn't go over particularly well with the rest of Christendom. I mean, come on. It's kind of like moving the government of this country to Kearney, Nebraska. I'm sure the rent is cheaper, but there's no Smithsonian in Kearney. There's no Washington Monument in Kearney. There's no Lincoln Memorial in Kearney, right? The government belongs in D.C. That's where we've been conditioned to think of it as there. And yeah, the Pope belongs in Rome, right? And true. I mean, other England is saying, people in Spain are saying, people in Germany are saying, what about us? Are we not important too? Why is the Pope essentially taking orders from the King of France? So there is a long-term lobbying effort to get the papacy put back in Rome where it belongs. And that occurred in 1377 when Gregory XI succumbed to pressure and moved the papacy back to Rome. And he promptly died the next year. Okay? Here's an aerial shot of the papal palace at Avignon. You can go there and have a tour and see what it looked like. Okay. Unfortunately, just because you return the papacy to Rome doesn't mean that you've solved this problem. In fact, worse problems are to come. So when Gregory XI dies, the cardinals meet in conclave, right? They meet in conclave to elect a new pope. And outside of the meeting, a Roman mob has gathered. And they're starting to chant, we want an Italian. We want an Italian. We're so sick of these French popes taking orders from the King of France. We want one of us to be pope. And the cardinals sort of duly elected an Italian who took the name Urban VI. Unfortunately, he's kind of like your best friend who is made hall monitor, and the power goes to his head and he immediately starts bossing everyone around. It's kind of like Urban VI. He immediately decided. They thought he was a colorless functionary who could be controlled. But no, once he becomes Pope, he decides to start bossing everyone around. In fact, he starts enforcing the rules. No, you can't have a mistress. No, you can't have more than one benefice, and so on. And so there was a number of cardinals who abandoned Rome, went back to Avignon, and they declared that the election of Pope Urban VI was made under duress. Therefore, it was null and void. Therefore, they deposed Urban VI and they elected a new pope who took the name Clement VII. And he ruled from Avignon. And when he died, he was replaced by Benedict XIII. Now, this is called the Great Schism. Okay? There have been schisms before. There have been rival claimants to the papacy. Okay? But this is something different. This really is a great schism, because not only do you have rival popes, but you have rival colleges of cardinals, rival papal bureaucracies. Okay? And Christendom is divided in two. I mean, you can, some people recognize one pope, others recognize the other. Now, it's very useful for kings, right? They can always play the popes off against each other. It's like, if you don't give me what I want, I'll just recognize the other pope. So it's great for the kings of Europe, but it's really rather embarrassing for Christendom. Here is a map showing the various allegiances, okay? So as you can probably tell, the King of France recognizes the Avignon papacy. By contrast, England recognizes Rome. Northern Italy recognizes Rome, but Naples, Aragon, Castile, they all recognize Avignon. The Holy Roman Empire, it says variable allegiance. Obviously, the Holy Roman Empire is really a patchwork of different states. So some recognize one, others recognize the other. And Portugal as well switched its allegiance at one point. Okay, so how are we going to solve this intractable and embarrassing situation? Well, one solution were councils, church councils. Now, the popes don't like councils very much. Okay? The popes don't like councils because councils suggest that the power of the pope is not absolute. Okay? There have been councils before. I mean, the Council of Nicaea formulated the Nicene Creed, the Council of Chalcedon ruled on the nature of Jesus, and so on. But in general, popes will only call councils under the most pressing of issues, and they make sure that they dominate these councils. But in 1409, basically both sets of cardinals got together at Pisa in Italy, home of the Leaning Tower, and they said, yeah, this is embarrassing. So they deposed both popes and elected a new pope. That was Pope Alexander V. All this managed to do was to produce a three-way split. Okay, so now there are three popes. And when Alexander V died in 1410, the cardinals elected John XXIII as his successor. All right, so clearly this is not a tenable situation at all. So that led to another council, the Council of Constance, and this one wasn't called by the cardinals. This was called by the emperor himself, okay, the Holy Roman Emperor, and in this way he was acting like Constantine back in 325 by calling the Council of Nicaea. And so Sigismund called this council, and by this point, yeah, everyone said, yeah, let's do this. So they all gathered at Constance. Two of the popes voluntarily relinquished their titles. The third one didn't, but no one was listening to him by that point. And the council succeeded in electing a new man who took the name Martin V, and he went to Rome and sort of things were put back to normal. But Martin V, he wasn't particularly keen on conciliarism. Okay, he was like, okay, thank you so much, Council of Constance. You can go home now. Have a nice day. Don't call me. I'll call you. Right? Because he's now Pope, and he doesn't. He's grateful for the council for electing him, but he's not keen on taking any more advice from it because he's now the Pope. And that was kind of at odds with what a lot of people were hoping. They were hoping that there could be regular church councils. Say every 10 years there'd be a regular church council where, bishops and even priests and maybe some lay people as well could vote on church policy, and then the Pope would be in charge of enacting it. Okay, so these regular church councils would act as a kind of church parliament. All right? But, so this is the conciliar movement. The popes ultimately prevailed over the conciliar movement. They said, no. We are the heirs to St. Peter. We speak with the voice of God. You would not subject God to any kind of check like this, so we are going to continue with our absolutist ways, which is not necessarily a bad thing. The trouble is that a lot of these late medieval, early Renaissance popes were kind of worldly and wasn't particularly inspiring for your average Christian. We'll talk more about that later on. In the meantime, we'll talk about the other. So, as you can imagine, there's a great deal of discontent with the church. The Avignon papacy, the Great Schism, this wasn't impressive to your average Christian. The failure to stop the plague was a black eye to the papacy. The plague does come through when the papacy is at Avignon. And then, of course, the triumph over the conciliar movement as well was not particularly inspiring to a lot of people. And we saw that with the plague, some people do take religion into their own hands. We're talking about the flagellants who would go around and whip themselves. This was not approved by the church, but they didn't care. Clearly the church is not doing its job, so people will take religion into their own hands. And this kind of, this continues. Okay, I mean, heresy is a phenomenon in late medieval Europe. Okay, heresy, a heretical opinion is an opinion contrary to church teaching. As far as we're concerned, who cares, right? Let's celebrate diversity. Okay, we're all different. We all have different opinions. We'll find out who's right on Judgment Day. Okay, that's the way we think. That's not the way that the medieval church thought. The medieval church, it was very, very important that everyone be on the same page in terms of belief and in terms of practice. Okay? Heresy was like a cancer. All right? It can infect the body politic, and God's wrath will come down on you. It'll come down on everyone for tolerating heresy. And so it's very important to root out heresy. That's the church's line. But if the church is in a bad odor with ordinary people, they're less afraid of it. And they think maybe the church is wrong. It's not me who's wrong. And so that continues into the late Middle Ages. And I've got a couple of heretics up there. John Wycliffe on the one hand and Jan Hus on the other. Wycliffe was a theologian at Oxford University in England, and through his reading of the Bible and through his own cogitations, he came to many of the same conclusions that Martin Luther later came to. Okay, we'll talk more about Martin Luther. Suffice it to say that John Wycliffe also believed that we should have vernacular scripture. That is, that we should translate the scriptures into the local language so that ordinary people can get their hands on the Bible. The church doesn't particularly like that. It's not necessarily forbidden, but it's very frowned on. If you want to read the Bible, you should learn Latin and read the Latin Bible as endorsed by the church. Okay, you should read the Latin Bible, and the church does this on purpose. It doesn't want ordinary people reading the Bible. You have to be educated enough before the church will let you read the Bible. Okay, and there are reasons for this. But Wycliffe says this is ridiculous. Why should the church be the guardian of the Bible like this? Why shouldn't ordinary people get their hands on the Bible? So that's a thing. And then of course the biggie is that he doesn't believe that the Bishop of Rome is the Pope. The Bishop of Rome is just the Bishop of Rome. There's no reason why the Bishop of Rome gets to call the shots like this. He's parallel to the Bishop of Milan or the Bishop of London or the Bishop of Paris or any other bishop. He's not special. Now, Wycliffe had powerful protectors, and he died in his bed. But he also spawned followers who were known as Lollards. That originally was an insult. A Lollard means a mumbler, because they would get together, for Bible study, and they would pray extemporaneously. They would mumble their prayers. So that was a name that their enemies gave to them. And there were Lollard communities throughout England throughout the 15th century. Okay, now unfortunately for them, there was a revolution in 1399 when Richard II was deposed, and the Lancastrian dynasty comes to the throne. King Henry IV of England becomes king. And because he is a usurper, he feels that he has to cast himself as a legitimate king. And one of the ways he does this is by going after heretics. So even though, Lollard ideology says that the king should be head of the church. So if King Henry IV had gone in for Lollardy, he could have really shored up his position in England. But he figured that the better thing to do would be to cast himself as a good Catholic and to persecute Lollards. So we have people being burned at the stake in England in the reign of Henry IV. It's interesting. There are connections between England and Bohemia in the late Middle Ages. Richard II, King of England, 1377 to 1399. His queen was named Anne of Bohemia. Okay, Bohemia, of course, is the area around Prague in the modern-day Czech Republic. Okay? And so there are cultural connections between England and Bohemia, especially when Anne died. A lot of her posse went back to Bohemia, and some of the things they took back were these Wycliffite ideas. And they were picked up by Jan Hus, who was a priest, a Czech priest, who championed these various ideas. One of the things he kept harping about was utraquism, all right? That is communion in both kinds. Okay, we talked about how the doctrine of transubstantiation means that if you're taking communion, you only need to take the bread, because if it really is the flesh of Jesus, then it's got some blood in it, right? So you only need to take the bread, only the priest drinks the wine. Well, not if you are a Hussite, okay? If you are a follower of Jan Hus, it is very, very important that when you take communion, everyone gets bread and everyone gets wine. That's what it says in the Bible. That's what we're going to do. And as it happens, Hussitism then becomes sort of a vehicle for Czech nationalism. Okay, Bohemia is part of the Holy Roman Empire. The Holy Roman Empire, though, is culturally German, and Bohemia is culturally Czech. Czech is a Slavic language. And so, partly because of their discontent with being in the empire, a lot of Czechs went in for Hussitism. It becomes a badge. This is what we do here. This is what we Czechs do. We practice Hussitism. Okay? Now, if you go to Prague today, you will see any number of statues of Jan Hus and all sorts of things named after Jan Hus. And Jan Hus Day is a major day in the Czech Republic. Why? Because Hus was the emperor ordered him to come to the Council of Constance. He gave him safe conduct. So Hus came under the safe conduct to explain himself, and then the emperor reneged on his safe conduct and said, well, you've just convicted yourself of heresy, and so you will be burnt at the stake. And so he was executed at Constance in 1415. So that provoked a major rebellion in Bohemia. But both Wycliffe and Hus and Lollardy and Hussitism, they're products of the times. Okay, there's a lot of discontent with the church. A lot of people who they're upset with the gap between the claims of the church and the messy reality of the state of the church. So that is the end of our look at the late Middle Ages. Oh, wait, one last thing. Yes, here we go. Here's a portrait of Wycliffe, and here is a picture of Jan Hus being burnt at the stake at Constance. So that's a real shame. Okay? But this is the end of our look at the late Middle Ages. We'll start in on the Renaissance next time.